Hello and welcome to this special edition of Dialogue 2022 Year in Review. As 2022 draws to a close, what were the news stories that dominated this eventful year? How have these events influenced the lives of so many around the world? And what can we do to solve these problems in the year to come? To help us answer these questions, I'm happy to be joined today by Professor Huang Jing, Richard Van Wiszak Fellow, Robert Bosch Academy, Peter Kuznick, Professor of History from American University, and Michele Geraci, former Under-Secretary of State of the Ministry of Economic Development of Italy. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion, gentlemen. If we look back at 2022, the Russia-Ukraine conflict was certainly one of the most significant global events of the year. As a Chinese political analyst, myself was frequently asked about China's stance on this issue. Here is a snapshot of what I observed.
Obviously, China has made it very clear sovereignty and national territorial integrity should be respected, including that of Ukraine. On the other hand, China and Russia has a strong relationship, strategic partnership, what we call. But that's largely on strategic issues, but not exactly on this Ukraine crisis. So that's basically the Chinese stance, and China has tried to stay neutral. On one hand, China has provided support, humanitarian support, assistance to the Ukrainian side. On the other hand, China basically has asked Russia to talk to the Ukrainian side to find a way out of this crisis instead of continuing this military attack.
Even China condemned this action publicly, Russia will continue to do so because Russia thinks that's in their fundamental interests. So China, if you look at China, India, and other countries, basically they choose to stay neutral. On one hand, they basically express the regret, and they are not really supportive of such an invasion. But at the same time, they don't want to make Russia uncomfortable internationally. I think the idea is very clear. The official position, Taiwan is part of China. This is completely different from Ukraine, which is a sovereign nation. And I want to remind your audience, of course, like Australia, the US, or any English-speaking country, you can check your foreign policy toward China. Taiwan, there's a one China principle. Taiwan is part of China, and that's very different from Ukraine.
Well, besides this obvious, we know this human toll, of the civilians, as well as the soldiers. I wonder what are the impacts of the conflict, beyond this region. I mean, globally in other parts of the world. We'll start with Huang Jing, who is based in Berlin right now.
I think first and foremost, it has made the differences or the gap between global North and global South more obvious. For example, over 140 countries condemned Russia's aggression into Ukraine. But when the United States launched the all-in sanction against Russia, none of the global South countries participated. And they either take a neutral position or openly against it. This is the first. Second, I think this war essentially is an onslaught against the US-led international order. This will have a long-term impact, both on the world we're living in and also on Russia itself. I think the impact is quite negative. Last but not the least, of course, it also exposed that even between the most close allies, between the United States and its most close allies, there are differences. And I'm not sure how long these differences can be kept, can be still there. Last but not the least, I think that it also shows that in this world, we do have different nations and understandings about the so-called international order, how this international order should be maintained and improved. But in the short term, I think this war first and foremost has done Russia itself a great damage, and of course also done damage to to Ukraine now is suffering a disaster, both in terms of political, economic, and humanitarian terms, and also, of course, a damage done to the entire Europe and beyond. Eventually, I believe it takes a village, a global village, to stop this war, because this war so far has benefited nobody. And this is really a war that makes every one of us losers at the end.
Mm-hmm. Peter, do you agree? There's obviously global impact. Far beyond the European continent. It touches upon this basically geopolitical situation, or even reshape the geopolitical situation in the years to come.
I agree with that assessment. This has been a humanitarian disaster that nobody has benefited from. If anything, well, clearly the Ukrainians have suffered terribly. The assessment is 100,000 military deaths and at least 20,000 civilian deaths. The Russians, we don't know exactly, but probably 100,000 Russian military deaths. The global economic impact we've seen result of famine and hunger in Africa. It shows how interconnected we are as a global community, and why this kind of war should not be even conceivable in the 21st century. But even from the Russian standpoint, Vladimir Putin has been turned into an international pariah. The Russian military has been degraded. This has been a terrible blow to Russia. When, on the other hand, it's backfired in so many ways from the Russian perspective. It's solidified and unified NATO in ways that people thought were not possible. Macron himself has said that NATO was brain dead before this, but Biden has been able to mobilize the Europeans and much of the West against Russia in this way, in a way that hadn't been unified before. But I think the biggest danger, or one of the biggest dangers clearly, is the threat of nuclear war. This is back on the agenda and people's awareness again. For a long time, we had downplayed the threat of nuclear war. But from the beginning of this invasion, Putin started nuclear saber rattling. And it's curious that Putin is actually not the most extreme of the Russians. There's a lot of pressure on Putin from his right wing to be more aggressive. We've seen Kadyrov and others urging Putin to use nuclear weapons. And we've seen Podolyak, one of Zelensky's chief advisors, talking about preemptive nuclear strikes on the part of NATO. So we've seen a certain kind of madness developing from people who don't understand what nuclear weapons are. And you look, for example, when the Ukrainian missile mistakenly backfired and landed in Poland, Zelensky immediately called for a unified NATO response and said this was a Russian missile. Fortunately, Biden had the good sense to say, no, that's wrong. This is a Ukrainian missile. But that's how close we've come to the possibility of World War III. So we're in a situation on the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're in a situation now where this war has got to be ended as quickly as possible because of the humanitarian implications, not only for Russians and Ukrainians, but for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Well, given this grave situation right now, latest development, for example, the Patriot air defense system given by the United States and Russia obviously is increasing its military force from 1 million to 1.5 million. So Michele, if you look at, the future, the near future, for example, 2023, the new year, are we expecting something probably like a winter offensive, escalation of conflict? Or beyond that, are we hoping to finally, maybe because of the tiredness of having the war, is that possible? We can reach sort of, truce, if not peace.
In Europe and in my country, in Italy, people are starting to get tired of supporting a war that is not ending. They were told back in March that the economic sacrifices, for example, not buying gas from Russia, was a necessary and ethically even acceptable sacrifice in exchange for peace. What they are seeing now is that there is the economic sacrifice, but peace is not coming because, of course, the sanctions are not working to the extent of persuading Putin to withdraw. So the perception in European general public is, for 8 months we have done sacrifices, we were ready to do them, but we see no result. So the political support for government to continue to, without questioning the support to Ukraine, is weakening. And therefore, in Europe, we start seeing some divergences within countries, and even within countries, we have left, right-wing political parties that take slightly different views. So we are fragmenting what used to be a more united front back in March. So that's a sense of weakness. But economically, I think I agree with what we have, what the other people have said today. It's a big lose-lose for everyone, almost everyone. Maybe the US wins a little bit, but China is a loser because China wants stability in Asia. Even China would like to have peace, and this is the important role. I think that China not taking immediate and not condemning the war so vocally like other countries have done, in a way, it has left for itself the role of mediator.
Well, Peter, I mean, if China takes a proactive position to help resolve the issue, do you think the US, which is the driver to the either end of the conflict, will the US be happy to see China active in this process?
Not at this point, but perhaps if the situation continues, at some point, the U.S. will come to reason on this. But China's got to play a leading role in this. From the beginning, I wrote articles urging China to intervene and for Xi Jinping to become the peacemaker here. He's in the best position to do so. He's one person who Putin has to listen to. China also is Ukraine's leading trade partner. China does not like to see the militarization of the planet that's going on. I mean, what we've seen now is increased defense spending across the board. Most recently in Japan now, with this call for a 50% increase in Japan's military budget. And we see all 9 nuclear powers are modernizing their nuclear arsenals. China's increasing substantially. Britain's increasing substantially. So I don't think this is in anybody's interest again. China is not the only one who can play a leading role. The Vatican has been speaking out recently and offering itself as a venue for no preconditions negotiations there. We've heard some good things at times coming out of Germany, coming out of France, coming out of Turkey. The world would love to see this resolved. The problem is that neither Putin seems to be ready or Zelensky seems to be ready. And what we've seen going on, Michele is more optimistic than I am about the situation now. What I've seen is that all of these weapon systems that Biden says we're not going to give to Ukraine, we eventually decide we're going to give to Ukraine. So now it's Patriot missiles. Before that, there were others. So we haven't given our attack missiles yet, but maybe that'll be coming next. And so we're giving Ukraine the capability to keep fighting indefinitely with this not only training and advanced weaponry, but also intelligence and pouring more and more money. The U.S. has already spent $22 billion in military aid and scores of $1 billion beside that. But it's a conflict that Putin is making it sound like this is going to last through 2023 and maybe longer. And it looks like the West, Biden is trying to rally the West to persevere and keep supporting for another year or as long as this takes. And the longer this goes on, the more danger there is of some event precipitating a much bigger and even more catastrophic war.
Well, Huang Jing, I will go back to you again. You mentioned about the China-US, whether the US will continue to view China as the number one, basically, challenger for the US dominant position. Well, Xi Jinping and Joe Biden, they met each other, and there are some follow-up visits by officials from both sides. They met each other and talked to each other. Seems there is determination on both sides to implement some of the agreements by the leaders. So what's the expectation of the relationship in 2023?
I think the relationship will not get any better before it getting worse for several reasons. Reason number one, of course, United States still sees China as the most consequential challenges, still goes all the way, try to contain China, to crack down on China. And this is obvious. And also, just like the previous speaker said, United States is very supportive to to increase the military spending, rearmament to countries like Japan and so forth. We know that Japan was defeated in World War II, and Japan's constitution is a peaceful constitution. Japan should not have equipped itself for any offensive capabilities, but now Japan obviously violated that. And number three, that the United States seems to try to squeeze every drop of strategic value of Taiwan and try to provoke Taiwan. And even though the United States said it still continuously insist on one China policy, but a lot of doing is try to quite provocative. Of course, China will have to defend its so-called core interests and
core interests, yeah.
Core interests, and then to resist against that. But last but not the least, we know that Joe Biden administration from very beginning is not a very strong administration because of the internal politics. Now, after midterm elections, Joe Biden administration has become lame duck and has already will soon enter the so-called election mood. And as a result, it will have to take a even tougher stance against China, even though its capability of doing things become weaker. And it's a quite weak administration. In that regard, I do not believe United States and China will have maybe they have willingness, but not capability to improve this bilateral relationship. The last analysis, as I always say, is that this so-called US-China competition is actually a facade. Beneath this facade, the real challenge, the most formidable challenge for both Xi Jinping and Joe Biden comes from their own country, from within. So therefore, this so-called competition, in my view, is a race to see who can get its house in order first. And in that regard, it was driven not really by the issues they see each other on the other side. It was driven by internal politics. That's why this uncertainty of US politics, in my view, is the most fundamental and the essential obstacle to the bilateral relationship. So if we can keep the bilateral relationship manageable, we'll be lucky enough. I do not expect any improvement in the near future.
Okay, not much optimism over there. Michele, what about the China-European relationship? It seems both sides are working on at least to stabilize their ties, if not trying to make much more progress in terms of bringing the two sides closer.
I think that after a few years of Europe kind of drifting and maybe following the United States policy, over the last few months, there is more of a refocus on the real politics. We thought that after Angela Merkel left, Chancellor Scholz was going to be a little bit, let's say, more passive in taking Europe into a closer relationship with China. However, this is actually not happening. This is in a way good news because Scholz is now in a way winning its own internal battle with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Annalena Baerbock, who is clearly anti-China. Scholz kind of ignored her. His own Minister of Foreign Affairs went to China. BASF is announced on investment, so is Volkswagen. And so in a way, the relationship between China and the European Union relies on how two main countries put away ideology and bring back business into the table. Number one, of course, Germany. Number two is Holland. And we need to see how Holland, and specifically semiconductor company ASML, reacts to new restriction on trade embargo for lithography machinery export to China, because we know this is the core of the trade and commercial war between China and the United States. Now, if Germany and Holland take the lead in saying, let's do business. China is a competitor, but is also a market. Like every country is both a competitor and a market. So if we only look at one side of the equation, everyone is a competitor, we shouldn't trade with anyone, we shouldn't do business with anyone. But likely, if we also see the other side of the equation, we see this as an opportunity, then a more realistic, logical, and analytical, not ideological, more analytical approach to the relationship with China, I think will bring benefit. You know, if companies want to export to China, if they want to invest, fine. I don't think there is the fear of excessive dependence on China, just like we had with Russia. We don't really have a physical pipeline that tied us to China like we are tied to Russia gas supply. We also have, of course, the rejuvenation, I hope, of the Belt and Road, which is not between Europe and China, it's between Europe and China together to join, develop Asia and Africa. And this, in my view, yes, there is always risk when you do projects. Sometimes you make money, sometimes you lose money, but there is 6.4 billion people in two continents that need the development of infrastructure. China has the financial capital, Europe has the maybe soft power together, and the expertise that can be combined. I think together it could be a win-win situation. So I do think, and I do see, even in my own country, that people are starting to warm up to the idea that China is also an opportunity. And with the, I hope, good news coming out from China on reopening and getting rid of COVID once and for good, I tell you, in the next couple of months, there's going to be a new inflection point of growing interest about China. And I see on myself, because I see people starting to ask me more and more about what is happening in the China economy, how is recovering, because they see that the inflection point is coming also in China's domestic economy, which is, of course, is one of the key drivers for imports from other countries into China.
Mm-hmm. Well, Peter, if you, we talk about the wars and sanctions, related to Ukraine situation. Of course, one cannot forget the wars and the conflict in the Middle East, including Syria.
I have met a lot of Syrians who have told me that even if the war is about to be ended, that they want to leave because they have no water. They don't have the basic necessities for life. Syria was one of those states in the Arab world whose standard of living had become comparable to that of Western European countries. It was completely self-supporting in terms of food supplies, and the conditions prevailing in the field of health were fine. For instance, 95% of kids were all getting vaccination. Nowadays, the situation has considerably worsened. The unemployment rate, which was about 8%, is now over 50%. The rate of growth, which was about 4.5% per year per capita, has now become a rate of impoverishment.
Following the cessation of the hostilities, the United States has imposed very harsh sanctions on the Syrian people, targeting the weakest strata of the social society in Syria, of the Syrian society. So the poorest people in Syria, the weakest, are targeted now by the most powerful and rich country in the world, United States of America. This talks to you a lot about the human values and the democracy of the United States.
But look ahead, the engagement with the big powers that seems to be, changing. For example, China reinforced ties with Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries, and also the Arab nations. And of course, the US is also more or less changing its approach. For example, President Joe Biden described Saudi Arabia as a pariah state. saying that human rights should be at the core of U.S. engagement with the world, not the periphery. But then he went to Saudi Arabia. It just seems to be a contradictory to his words. So what do you make of the seems countries are becoming more realistic, or there's emerging or probably a multipolar system is in the making?
Well, we certainly are in a multipolar world right now, and the comfortable binaries don't seem to function. Biden began saying that the world is divided between democracies and autocracies, and he had a big democracy summit that he organized. But he doesn't talk so much that way now. It's more complicated. And so most of the countries, we see that democracies, as we're defining them as democracies, are actually receding around the world. And Biden has begun to realize and use even different language in describing the polarization that's taking place. And so in the Middle East, you look at America's two main allies there, Saudi Arabia and Israel. Well, neither of them is really supporting the U.S. position on Ukraine. They don't want to be sucked up into this game. In terms of U.S. and China, Biden's behavior is not a big surprise. If you look at who his top advisors are, he brought in 18 top advisors from the Center for New American Security. These are the China hawks. Their intention when they came to power was not to be involved in a war in Ukraine, although they certainly prepared for that in other ways, but it was really to go after China. And many of us hoped that Biden would break with Trump's hostile policies toward China, but Biden has doubled down on them. And you look at these advisors from the CNAS, it's the Campbells, it's the Sullivans, it's the Ratners. These people, their real agenda is to have a much more hostile confrontational relation with China. And that's what and that's why we see one of the consequences of this division of the world that's occurring is now NATO is orienting more toward the Pacific. And NATO is being used, or the United States would like to use NATO as a battering ram against China also. And so it's the United States, it's Japan, it's South Korea, the Philippines, Australia. They'd love to get India involved, but India doesn't want to play that game. And so the world is, we're looking back at 2022, and I think we all would agree that this has been a pretty horrible year for humanity, that we've taken steps backwards from the kind of world that we would love to see, a world based on peace and prosperity and good health and friendly relations. And so a big part of that is the shifting alliances, the realization in the United States, when they talk about the war in Europe, they can't always say this is the worst fighting that's occurred in Europe, the worst war in Europe since World War II. But they have to add in Europe because they don't want to mention Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so what much of the world sees the U.S. position and says, yeah, maybe it's the worst war in Europe, but look what the United States has been doing in the world, what role the United States is playing, which is not in any way to forgive what Putin is doing now in Ukraine, because that is a disaster, a humanitarian and political and geopolitical disaster. But we have to maintain some sense of balance and proportion and figure out ways to move forward to make 2023 a better year than 2022 was, because as a planet, we're really going the wrong direction.
Well, with that, we come to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us.